It's so interesting that what you said about, you've never heard these stories. And I don't think it's not because you're not informed. I feel like nobody hears these stories. And if I hadn't known, if I didn't have personal relationships to these people who are like showing this resilience, I wouldn't know them either, because the media is so specific. If you notice, the media is so specific with the stories they choose to tell of the Pacific. And so it's always in that lens of we're victims drowning, waiting for a handout. They'll never tell a story of some 60-year-old woman in Kiribati getting up at 5 a.m. and building seawalls.
I'm still reeling from the Kingdom of Ice story. I'm still reeling from that. Anything to do with the news and islands, I'm kind of just like, I'm turning off now. Yeah, but that's very true. Very true.
And so I think that's another reason why we don't really hear these stories that can actually enrich our experience as people trying to create change, because there are people who've already done it, like you've said. In terms of adaptation, I know so many, and it's my privilege just being in the climate space and knowing these people, but I know so many people who have made like ingenious plans to adapt and do it on a daily basis. And I think that we need to get to a point where we're not just telling the stories of adaptation, but telling this also the stories of the reality of climate change and in the good and in the bad, because we also need to mitigate. I think it's easy for big governments to say, oh, we can just keep emitting because they're adapting to it, like they're doing fine.
Yeah.
I think there was
what's the big problem? They've got floating fellas now. They should be all good.
Yeah. So there was that, I think the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, I don't know if you ever watched, I think it was on the news a couple of years ago, maybe last year, where he said, don't worry about climate change. The Pacific Islands are going to be fine because they pick our fruit. And so he insinuated that we're going to be fine because if their islands sink, they'll just come to Australia and pick our fruit. And that's like a whole different conversation around like environmental racism. I won't start there. But yeah, if that answers your question, there are stories of people doing this work, and I feel like the big governments do know it's happening. They just choose to be blind. And I think they will always choose to not do anything until the people who vote them in tell them to move.
Or unless they're directly impacted by it.
Yes.
You've actually piqued my interest. I want to know about climate racism. Now that you bring it up, I actually want to know. What do you mean by climate racism? Because I've never heard the term before.
Yeah, so climate or environmental racism is... It was a term coined in a lot of the African small communities who saw that big corporations or extractive industries didn't care about the environmental harm they did to them because they didn't really see them as equals to them being white.
Right.
And so it also makes you question, when there's a cyclone in the Pacific, it hardly gets any traction on the news if there was a hurricane in Florida, or who we choose to really care about when they lose land. You also see it show up in the way, who have we chosen to be like the poster child of climate action, where there's been decades of Indigenous young people standing up against climate change and standing up against the hands that feed it, and then years later, like a little white girl from Europe comes and everyone praises her.
Yay. Yay for the Palangis.
Yeah, and so this is where you juggle with this idea of climate racism. And a really clear case for this is the situation of Marshall Islands. So Marshall Islands was under the U.S. administration when the U.S. decided to use those islands as testing grounds for their bombs, their nuclear bombs. And so they tested, I think, close to 70 nuclear bombs around Marshall Islands and on Marshall Islands that were 3 times as big as the bomb that was dropped in Hiroshima. So that's how big these bombs were. And why did they do it? Because they were able to do it and they didn't care about what would happen.
No one was stopping them, right?
No one was stopping them. And there's that element of racism there too, where these islands are seen as disposable. These people are seen as, well, if they get, if they get harmed, it's okay because they're not American citizens, right? And this was so clear in the way that they cleaned up their nuclear waste. So when the U.S. administration had done all the testing, they told the islanders, we're going to clean this up and we're going to put it in a dome.
I know the case, yeah.
And a part of this cleanup, they also shipped nuclear waste from Nevada in the U.S. And so they knew in their head that this waste was dangerous, and they didn't want U.S. citizens in Nevada exposed to it. So they dug up all that dirt in Nevada and they sent it to Marshall Islands to be buried in this dome.
The dome, yep.
This dome now is experiencing cracks in it because of climate change and sea level rise, and the U.S. is doing nothing about it. And so climate change is almost this way that these colonizers have pointed the finger to these islanders twice, right? I don't care about you, so I will bomb your island. I don't care about you, so I'll let your island sink. And that really makes you question, who's privileged to survival and who is not.